So let's talk about the power of the World Eaters units in Warhammer 40K 10th edition with a tier list of datasheets from their recent Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about World Eaters units, their power levels, and what's making them either strong or weak on the tabletop right now. At time of recording, it hasn't been so very long since the World Eaters Codex came out, and armies have started to hit tournaments. Reaction to the book was a bit on the mixed side, some scary stuff but also some downgrades or annoying side grades. Overall, it looks like at first impressions the book's at least fairly well balanced within the general power spectrum of Warhammer 40k. No actual grand tournament wins so far, though really quite a lot of high placings in the first couple of weekends, with win rates around about the 48 to 49% sort of range, depending a bit on exactly which source you look at. It seems that the two detachments that people are playing with the most are the Berserker Warband for its reliable melee damage and a few solid stratagems, and the Khorne Demonkin one where you can ally in their demonic units, most of which are pretty solid and usable right now. Overall, at first impressions it looks like they're solidly playable. They're probably making an entry of sort of mid to lower mid tier in 40k, as opposed to right at the very top of the shop like Death Guard seem to be. For this one I'm just going to try and do a rough tier list of World Eaters units and their power right now. Obviously tier lists in Warhammer 40k are all very arbitrary. Some things could be ranked a bit higher or lower depending on the exact army and context and how you're playing with it. Obviously detachments will make a big difference. I'm going to mainly focus on Berserker Warband with some nods to the Khorne Demonkin as well, given that seems to be the army's strongest form initially. Though obviously if you're playing one of the detachments that heavily revolves around one type of datasheet, that's likely to mean that that unit's going to be far more standout and need to be included in those ones. In any case, for this one I've split the army into 4 rough tiers of current strength, with tier 1 aiming to be the majority of the competitive choices, and splitting that one into an upper and lower half. I'll also talk about the demons as well, though in their own section at the end. Given they're locked to one detachment, they need to be taken in context of that one really, and they just broadly feel like they're either probably includes or probably not includes. In any case though, lots to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. I'll start talking through some units in the Codex. First up, we have the obligatory aircraft and fortifications tier it seems. I still rate the Helldrake as the weakest datasheet in the Codex most likely. 200 points for a fast-moving hover aircraft with anti-fly 2+, and either a torrent weapon or a rapid-fire autocannon. The World Eaters one gets a +1 to hit versus fly targets and 6 attacks in melee. Against armies that don't have the fly keyword, it's just really quite disappointing both in terms of damage and defense. It's just not going to do anywhere near as much as other units, and the speed doesn't do enough to make up for that. Though if you do have a big scary fly target that you can get into and then trigger a bunch of devastating wounds, it's probably going to do okay in those matchups. Overall, as ever with aircraft though, it just doesn't really compare very well with the rest of the datasheets, and Games Workshop often give them points costs that just keep them out of any sort of optimized list most of the time. Beyond the Helldrake though, I would basically rate the vast majority of other World Eaters units as at least usable, though for these ones I'd rate them as highly likely to be overshadowed by other datasheets in the Codex. It's not that you couldn't make them work if you want to, but it just seems like the vast majority of the time a list will be directly stronger with something else in its place. First up we've got the World Eaters Terminator Squad, 185 points or 370 for 10. They're fairly tanky compared with some of the other infantry, and with their damage they've got some fairly punchy power fist style melee attacks, though perhaps most impressively they've got their big rapid fire reroll hit rolls on their combi bolters, and it means they could pretty easily cut down some lighter infantry or chew through a few space marines in the shooting phase before they charge in. I'd say that might be one of their biggest standout selling points, though it is a bit unfortunate that mass combi bolter fire still is only really good against certain targets. It's not going to do much against say Terminator equivalents or vehicles if you have to go into them. Otherwise they can deep strike, so can rapid ingress, though they are competing against Exalted 8-bound for that, or even Lord Invocators with Berserkers. They don't have any leader options to take advantage of any good enhancements, as you might want to have in a big high investment unit, and just in general it seems that people prefer the faster moving and slightly harder hitting 8-bound at the moment. Currently it seems at least that if you're including elite infantry for the World Eaters, it's usually the 8-bound or maybe the Exalted variant. Next up we've got some furious rapid fire support with the Predator tanks, 145 points for either variant. Out of the two I'd rate the Annihilator as the better one, essentially 5 las cannon shots within 24 inches and being able to reroll wound and damage rolls on all of them that happen to hit. That's some fairly furious anti-tank at least. The Destructor trades out its normal extra AP against infantry rule for handing out a -1 to hit debuff, which doesn't really feel quite as standout really. In general, World Eaters tend to go quite light on the firepower units, given that all their synergies tend to go towards melee, and at the moment the Predator tank's biggest weakness is probably that they're competing for a slot with the Forge Fiend, which is around about the same cost, and just in terms of the sheer ferocity of the damage there's no real contest there. Those things just have enormously efficient firepower. Next up we've got the Chaos Land Raider, which like with a lot of Chaos factions isn't really terrible in terms of getting units to combat, but it's just kind of an overinvestment to do so compared with just getting them up the board on their own. The World Eaters just don't really have anything where the Land Raider's the optimal transport. Berserkers are fine with Rhinos if you want one and can move 8 inches up the board anyway. 8-bound already moved 10 inches, so the Land Raider's not really likely to get them to the fight any faster by the time it's had to go around some terrain, and Terminators I think struggle to have enough threat and value for the big justification of the big transport cost, plus they can deep strike and rapid ingress as well. They do have the added interest of rapid fire las cannons, and averaging 4 hits with those within 24 inches is quite a nice bonus. They're definitely not unusable as a unit, but if you want a firepower unit there's plenty of things that will outshoot them, and for transport purposes nothing really seems all that optimal for them, to be honest. Next up we've got the Khorne Lord of Skulls, a massive 505 points for this big chunky demon engine of Khorne. For that points cost you get some pretty impressive stats, 24 wounds with toughness 13 and a 5+ invulnerable save. Some seriously heavy firepower capable of cracking armour at 24 inches away really quite well with all those rapid fire rules, moves fairly fast with 12 inches and can smash through terrain, and then rather enormous melee threat with that great big cleaver of Khorne, and also buffs the blessing roll. Obviously it's enormous points cost, but enormous abilities as well, but it looks like for most people the Lord of Skulls just isn't really seen as all that optimal. When it's a 500+ point unit it needs to be absolutely game changing, and might be always a question as to whether or not to include one or not. Its big footprint can still have issues with terrain on tables and being screened, and certain armies might still well be able to destroy one at least fairly comfortably, if they're packing the right kind of strength 14 or higher firepower normally. As normal with big solid stompy scary things, I'd say it's maybe a unit that has a bit more value in more casual games rather than high-end competitive ones, probably going to be a little bit stronger there. I would rate them as a bit overshadowed versus the competition with that enormous price tag, but still maybe one of the slightly stronger ones out of this particular tier. I rate it towards the top of this tier. It's a big central unit to potentially build around for the Jackal detachment if you want to make the Cult of Blood work as well, so it will be a bit more tempting to include in that one. Next up, and unfortunately we have Angron himself. The Demon Primarch of the World Eater seems to have fallen on some hard times compared with his index form. It was still certainly a fun model to use in game. He moves fast and hits ridiculously hard, a bunch of damage d6 plus 2 attacks, all with devastating wounds now. Though despite a points decrease, he got nerfed in a whole bunch of different ways in the Codex. The mechanics of how he revives got a lot less favourable. I'd say his aura buffs are a bit less useful as well, though I guess the chance to lock units in close combat could be really big if it's unreliable. I think he in particular really didn't enjoy losing access to those really good mobility buffs. It means that you could have him in a fairly safe spot and then strike out a massive difference to kill something. Overall at 385 points at the moment he just feels a bit on the overcosted side. I could probably do with a fairly solid points decrease to get him back in the running again. Finally for this tier we've got the Demon Prince with wings. He's 180 points. He also moves fast and hits with a bunch of strength 8 damage 3 attacks on the charge, potentially going up to strength 10 if he's in Berserker Warbands. His special rules are maybe a bit weaker than the average Demon Prince ones though. He's got a Mortal Wound sweep attack and a Battle Shock rule. At 10 wounds at toughness 9 with some high saves, it's not a pushover to take down, but certainly not particularly tough for the cost. Generally if you want an all-out damage dealer, then probably units like 8-bound are going to add more for a cheaper cost, and if you want a big scary Demon Prince, then typically the Foot Princes tend to add more currently. They've got some fairly nice supporting rules and a lone operative option. It still could be interesting enough with a suitable enhancement though. Having him with -1 damage or a big melee buff definitely makes him a bit scarier. Before we move onwards and upwards to the next tier, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. They're one choice for some easy to store and transport terrain to cover a battlefield for Warhammer 40k and do things a bit differently with their sort of folding pop-up cardboard terrain system. The idea behind their stuff is that you have 12 cardboard tiles laid out into a 3x4 grid to make a 45x60 inch battlefield. Each of those cardboard squares folds out and up pops a building, so you basically get an entire Warhammer 40k battlefield that can store completely flat and be put away in a box set the same sort of size as a normal sized board game. The design does come with some trade-offs, and I'll talk about a few of the positives and negatives at the end of the video for those interested, but I'd say its biggest unique selling point is being so easy to store and transport if space is tight where you live or you want to take a terrain set around to a friend's house for a game or something. They've got a few different designs available, ones for a Shattered Hive, an Overgrown Capital, and a Chaos Factory type thing, so feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this video. Next up, we've got a whole bunch of units I've placed in tier 2. I rate these as solid enough datasheets, maybe usable but not feeling quite so stand out to me as the ones I've rated higher up. First up, we've got the Master of Executions, who's 60 points, a cheap generic character that can be put with Berserkers. He has a bit more threat against tough stuff with a bunch of strength 7 damage 2 attacks with devastating wounds, and that'll make them just that bit more threatening against tough targets. He allows them to reroll advances and blood surge rolls, gets a command point if he kills a character, and he gets precision on his special weapons all the time. I feel like for the 60 points he's just not really all that stand out in his own right, but could be an interesting option if you say need to bear an enhancement and want a squad to run with them in a Rhino. Maybe the Berserker Glaive could be nice enough for a cheapish threatening character, and he'd be a central character for the Gore-Track Onslaught options. In general though, I'd rate him as second place to Khan. He'd be my first choice for leading Berserkers in transports, and then this guy far more borderline. Next up, we've got Lord Invocatus for 110 points. He's an 8 wound Juggernaut Lord with some better melee and devastating wounds, but also with a higher points cost. He adds some mortal wounds to that melee damage as well. Doesn't have to go around terrain when he's joined infantry now, and perhaps the most interesting thing is that he can allow units to deep strike, so you could have some Khorne Berserkers coming in from reserves, potentially rapid ingressing for close range charges, or setting up heroic interventions. Overall, between all that, he seems like okay value for what he adds to an army. Seems that some people like him, though I'd say it's maybe not crazily necessary. I feel like the generic characters maybe add a bit more interest for being able to bear good enhancements from their respective detachments. The deep strike thing is pretty fun at least. Next up, we've got the Defiler, which I'd probably rate towards the lower end of this particular tier. This guy's the standard general purpose shooty and fighty demon engine, again getting a bunch of benefits from the World Eater's new rapid fire tendencies with their shooting, and that means that he can fire out really quite a lot of shots with rapid fire light cannons and battle cannons and more. On top of that, his melee is fairly scary, a bunch of strength 16 and damage d6 plus 1 attacks, plus maybe a scourge to back it up depending on the options you've taken. The intercept rule within 12 inches isn't nothing, the 10-inch move makes him at least fairly fast, and is able to crawl over certain small bits of terrain, which could help him get into the fight quite a bit easier than some. Overall, I'd rate it as a usable generalist. I probably wouldn't say as standout as the Hellbrute or the Forge Fiend on the Demon Engine front, though I did notice some will manage to do well with Defilers and take a bunch of them to a grand tournament and do well, so certainly seems like they've got the potential to surprise people. Finally for this one, we've got the more dedicated melee bruiser that is the Mauler Fiend. At base, 8 attacks at strength 14, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1, plus either some close range melter to back it up, or its lasher tendrils. Even in World Eaters, both of those seem acceptable enough. Its 12-inch move is quite fast, and it might particularly like Gore-Track Onslaught for the smash through wall stratagem that it has. Its special rule helps it out with some charge and damage buffs against injured units, which might be possible to set up with a little bit of shooting, maybe dedicated from a Forge Fiend or something. There's certainly a big scary threat that the opponent's going to have to really think about keeping away from both medium infantry, and particularly things like knight equivalents, where that damage profile could go through them pretty quickly. I'd say perhaps its main weakness is competing with the Hellbrute. It definitely has some good advantages over that, but just the sheer amount of carnage that they can do with their double activations, I think puts them ahead of the Mauler Fiend for most people. Moving on though, and now we get into units that far more regularly see competitive World Eaters play. Here are the ones I've rated in Tier 1, which I've chosen to split into a lower and upper half, though you could probably just equally look at this as Tier 1 and Tier 2 I suppose. Probably the single unit choice that was most borderline between this and putting down in the previous tier was the Lord on the Juggernaut. He's 90 points at base, and I feel like, as with Lord Invocatus, he's nothing particularly crazy for his raw profile. He gets a whole bunch of AP-1 and damage 2 attacks. He has the potential to run Berserkers up the field on foot a bit faster, moving them at 10 inches, which could be nice for squads of 20, and can bear generic enhancements while also being fairly cheap and at least somewhat tanky, which could mean it's maybe not a horrible choice just to run solo if you want an enhancement on the board. For the main downsides, his damage output is just a bit unexciting when it doesn't help out Berserkers too much against tough stuff, and not being able to go in transports doesn't help crazily either. The thing that really does sell him though is if he's in the Khorne Demonkin detachment, he's got the enhancement where you can have him lead a unit of Blood Crushers. At the moment it seems that rules as written he gives the Blessings of Khorne to the Blood Crusher units, so that's a pretty massive buff just to be adding in there, and between them and him and their mortal wound impact hits, you make a squad that's going to be an enormous threat to just about anything in melee. Overall I feel like he's probably a bit mid there, but a really strong choice in the Demonkin detachment, so definitely a bit detachment dependent for him I suppose. Next up we've got the Exalted 8-bound. They're one of the focal mainline damage dealers of the book, moving fast with their 10-inch movement, with 3 wounds at toughness 6 on the defensive side of things. Compared with the regular 8-bound, they've only got the 4 attacks, but get AP 3 and the anti-vehicle and monster keywords on those brutal chain fists that they have. So basically the unit of choice able to jump in against enemy monsters and vehicles and cut a massive amount of wounds off them really quite reliably, never mind any buffs that you get from detachments or blessings. If a vehicle happens to survive against them, you could force desperate escape tests to fall back. That's not a common rule that can affect monsters and vehicles, so the potential for the opponents to lose big there or have to burn a command point if they want to re-roll to try and keep them safe. They also deep strike as well, so it could be an interesting choice for a rapid ingress threat to get them into their favoured foe. Looks like in competitive lists, most people are rating them as perhaps the junior partner of the regular 8-bound, often desired to have in a list to jump on those really tough targets, but maybe not having quite as many of them versus the regular 8-bound, particularly with their scout moves to get them into a nice forward position, and then a bunch of general purpose attacks that can take just about any buffs well. To potentially lead the 8-bound and the Exalted ones, we've got the Slaughterbound. He's 85 points and just seems fairly reasonable enough to add a whole bunch of damage and threats to a regular 8-bound unit. It seems that a fair few people are running units of 3 with a Slaughterbound in them, so giving you a super dangerous scout move threat. For around about 235 points plus any enhancements, he adds a whole ton more punchy damage to attacks, particularly in his big go turn when he gets an extra +3 attacks and devastating wounds as well, and it seems fairly common to run him with the Berserker Glaive in the Berserker Warband, so that massive amount of attacks lands home with damage 3. It also means that the opponent has to be really careful about destroying his squad, as if they don't commit enough or roll a bit low, he might have one of his 8-bound companions survive and allow him to restore another one to the unit. If he ever manages that, then you've basically healed 50 points then and there, never mind all the stuff that he adds personally for that game that'd take him from being just a good unit to a standout great value one. In any case, looks like he's doing well enough to make the cut in a number of tournament lists, and like the other 8-bound, he's a central character for the lesser played Possessed Slaughter bands. Next up, we've got the Khorne Berserkers, 180 points for 10 of them, or 360 for 20. They bring mass strength 4 attacks to the table, though strength 6 on the charge in Berserker Warband, plus some Eviscerators to help them out against some slightly tougher stuff. Going up to strength 6 is a really big deal for them, plus they've got some great supporting stratagems there. They get to advance and charge, they've got the big Blood Surge move, and they've got an extra AP stratagem, all of which could make the difference between them being a somewhat impactful unit or an absolutely terrifying one in the right situation. Probably for the way I'd be most tempted to play them, it'd be in a Rhino with Khan the Betrayer. His big damage profile and buffs can make the difference between them being a threat to lighter stuff or really heavy stuff, and then hopefully after they've jumped out and destroyed something, they can at least force the opponent to back off if they want to deal with them, basically knowing that they have to be at least 9 inches away unless they want to wind up in combat with the Berserkers and maybe Khan as well. Could be seriously problematic if you want to move forward to take the mid-board objectives. I have seen some people using them in other ways though. You could be deep striking them with Lord Invocatus, or running a big 20 strong squad with a Juggernaut Lord if you wanted to. And probably the other detachment that could be most fun for them is Goretrack Onslaught. That basically revolves around Berserkers jumping out of Rhinos, and the Lance keyword will help them there. I feel like their Strength 4 is a bit on the unfortunate side though. I think it probably would have been nicer to keep the Strength 5 and then just have the Berserker Warband take them up to Strength 6, then there'd be a little bit more general purpose for other detachments. Next up, and kind of alongside the Khorne Berserkers, there's the Chaos Rhino to get them into the fight. Generally a good idea if you're using 10 of them, as it can get them into the mid-board without them being shot up too much. If you want to charge straight out of it, it'll give them an extra 3 inch to their threat range essentially, due to them jumping out the front of it. They're durable for the points cost, and if there's nothing within charge range, it can just zoom up to the mid-board, and maybe ideally hiding next to a ruin so they can get out in safety. Its special rule also has a bit of interest with the option to get Berserkers out in the enemy turn if it makes sense. Often it might not, but you might be able to either bait out Blood Surge moves or swing an objective if it's safe to. It depends what the enemy has chosen to move forward with. As mentioned before, I feel like 10 Berserkers with Khan in a Rhino is a really solid combo, and if you wanted to use Goretrack Onslaught, it does have some pretty crazy synergies there. Perhaps in particular the Jump Out and Blood Surge rule could get things into combat from a really long way away. Next up, we've got the rather cheap and terrifying threat that is the Hellbrute, 120 points for a big scary melee machine that now also moves a bit faster at its base movement rate of 9 inches, and sees a lot of play in competitive lists with double melee weapons, usually for 8 attacks or more in the Berserker Warband on the charge. I've seen people running it with different things, Fist and Hammer maybe being the most common, that you could go double fist for the 2 heavy flamers if it gets shot, or maybe a melee weapon plus a Scourge. What makes the Hellbrute super stand out is its ridiculous extra damage output. If you charge into a unit with this, then it gets to make its attacks, presumably kill a bunch of things, and when they activate to strike back against you, that triggers its fight again special rule, so it can immediately make more attacks at the enemy unit, and you could be getting something like 18 attacks out of the thing, all at some very seriously scary profiles. It could get even worse if you're able to kill one thing and consolidate into another enemy unit, or even better be able to engage 2 enemy units at the same time, provided they can't actually kill it. And unlike maybe a fair few other Hellbrutes or Dreadnought equivalents in 40k, this guy absolutely has enough damage to justify his points. It means that maybe the main question is trying to get him to melee. The 9-inch movement where you have to go around terrain isn't excellent. It means that a lot of the time he might be getting shot before he gets to the enemy lines. It could be an interesting option to rapid ingress from the sides of the board, provided there's not something that's just going to flat out delete him with shooting. Could be interesting in Goretrack Onslaught like the Mauler Fiend as well, for that smash through wall stratagem. Overall, these things are seriously scary, and you definitely have to think hard about how you're going to deal with them. I'll probably raise them towards the upper end of this tier, maybe borderline with the next tier up. Finally for this section, we've got the Goremongers, 85 points for the World Eaters Infiltrators, Blood Mad Jackal Cultists who have replaced their legs with bounding limbs, and a whole bunch of melee attacks that's largely themed at destroying lighter infantry, and they can move fast with a 9-inch move as well. Generally the decision for these ones seems to be whether or not you take any of them or one unit perhaps. Infiltrators is definitely a useful thing to have just for winning the whole game of 40k on the whole. Screening back enemy infiltrators and scouts, and for World Eaters allowing their own units to scout, particularly spawn and regular 8-bound. If you have a unit of Goremongers strung out into the midfield, then it means that the opponent can't block those units going forward with their own scouts. Beyond that, they could be in a good position to do first turn secondary objectives, or potentially tie up or even kill some lighter infantry units. It does feel like at 85 points though they are paying a points premium for being infiltrators, and I feel like most really wouldn't want to go too heavy on them. For the top of the main tier list though, here are the units at the moment that seem to be seeing the most competitive play. A combination of the units that are just most efficient for their points, or have other good reasons to be in the vast majority of lists. First up, we've got the regular World Eaters 8-bound. I would still say that these are a little bit on the pricey side compared with what World Eaters players would probably want. 150 points for 3 of them, and that gets you 3 possessed equivalents. Not really very good defensive stats on that side of things, but certainly very general purpose, nasty damage output, a whole bunch of strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks, and going up to strength 10 and more of those attacks in Berserker Warband on the charge of course. It's just a profile with the sheer volume of those attacks, plus the buffs that you can get from Blessings of Khorne, or maybe certain damage dealer stratagems that's going to be absolutely ruinous to a bunch of enemy units out there, and they make themselves and everything else nearby better against anything besides monsters and vehicle units. Their scout moves are really nice for getting them into a threatening position early as well. They can use that to take up a position behind a mid-board ruin, and then be an absolutely monstrous threat that the opponent can't afford to ignore. As mentioned, it seems like a fair few people are using them with a Slaughterbound as well, which with his big damage turn, where you get extra attacks and devastating wounds, plus maybe an enhancement like the Berserker Glaive, it can take the unit from just a very scary general purpose threat into one that can deal with some of the mainline enemy units in their army. There are also essential units for that possessed Slaughterbound attachment if you happen to be playing that too. Despite being strong, fast and scary, they're still not a unit that every single army take lots of though. Maybe usually around 6 of them, perhaps broken down into 2 different squads, and some forces use more or less. Next up, we've got the standard Bloodmad Cultists in the Jackals, 65 points for 10 of them, and perhaps out of any of the World Eaters units, these guys still seem to be one of the single most auto-include out of them, for 65 points for a cheap unit that can hold down the home field objective and also have sticky objectives to boot, then it's just a really good deal. And in general, they tend to get taken in slightly smaller numbers, often just one squad, but sometimes more, to put the sticky objectives rule on the home field at point, and then from there they can still beat up light infantry fairly well, particularly on the charge in Berserker Warband, and they can move at least somewhat fast with 7 inches. It means that if the opponent tries to deep strike something somewhere near the home field, they have the potential to rush off and deal with that threat. Otherwise, just being one of the cheapest units that the World Eaters can put on the table has some value all of its own right. If you have to dedicate a squad to doing a secondary or something, then these guys are good for that. And if you want to do screening things, then better that these guys die compared with some other stuff. Between all that, they seem to be in pretty well auto-include status. They're usually in small numbers, doing a support role, and for units venturing into the mid-board, Spawn often tend to be the unit of choice there. Next up, we've got Khan the Betrayer himself. I've already mentioned him a bit, but 85 points and basically the difference between the Berserkers being a big threat to elite infantry and heavier stuff or not. On the charge, his profile's really quite dangerous. 9 attacks at strength 9, AP -2 and damage 3 if you happen to be in the Berserker Warband, so a pretty nasty profile for cutting down Terminators. That'll still stack plenty of saves on top of vehicles, particularly with some blessings in play like lethal hits. On top of that, he also gives his squad the rather good damage buff of reroll 1s to hit and to wound, which is plus 36% compared with what you normally have, and between that and his very good melee stats, it's just going to take a Berserker unit and make it just way more dangerous than it would have been otherwise. That's just good in general, though maybe extra helpful when they're blood surging and they might not get the +2 strength on the charge, so he can still be a huge threat in melee that isn't dependent on that. Otherwise, his Revive on Death rule is pretty excellent added value as well. Once his unit gets wiped, he'll stand back up for another go. He could have the chance to do some objective things, or just throw that big attack profile to claim a few more skulls for the Blood God before he gets taken down. And a few people choose to run him solo due to that Revive on Death rule. It's a pretty big deal when you know that he can survive any one shooting phase and then just stand back up again in all likelihood, so it can buy you 1 turn of screening or standing on an objective, or 2 turns worth of damage. I likely run him with Berserkers in a Rhino though, as overall the combo is just very efficient and nasty. Next up, we've got the Chaos Spawn, and these guys seem to be also basically an auto-include territory for chaff units to throw themselves into the mid-board and cause problems. They're really fast compared with the rest of the army. They scout 8 inches up the board, and then can advance and charge on top of a 10-inch move. So they're downright odds-on to make charges straight into the enemy deployment zone turn 1 if you want them to, if it makes more sense to cause nuisance straight away, as opposed to bully enemy units in the midfield or something. For their 80 point cost, their damage really isn't too bad at all. 15 attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, and with their 4+ to hit, they take buffs from the Blessings of Khorne rather well. Again, Berserker Warband helps them out, going up to an average of 17 attacks at strength 7. Their defensive stat line isn't a pushover. 4 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ save and a 5+ feel no pain. They aren't going to get shot down by a single volley of small arms or anything like that, and will need things a bit more focused, even if they're not exactly standout durable. Overall, it seemed hard to go wrong with a unit or two of these. It seems that most competitive lists are running between 2 and 3 squads of them. They also could be quite good users of that sticky objectives and death stratagem in Berserker Warband, perhaps trading a somewhat cheap unit for an objective that you can still score if there's an objective on the outskirts of your army. Next up, to oversee the advance of Khorne, we've got the Demon Prince on foot. He's a little pricier than his winged equivalent with a 200 point cost, the same fairly solid damage profile going up to strength 10 with a bunch of attacks on the charge, and he also gets devastating wounds as well when he's charging, which makes him a bit more threatening against tougher options, and he can gain the lone operative rule when he is nearby certain World Eaters units, keeping him safe from enemy shooting. His big buffering rule gives you discounted stratagems for units within 12 inches, which is quite a big deal and quite a long range for that. Some of the Berserker Warband stratagems are just really quite efficient, and to be able to get more of those thrown around on the table is a big deal indeed, and he's also more efficient with some of the enhancements as well. The Helm of Brazen Ire for -1 damage, or the Berserker Glaive for extra melee fight, both of those seem very usable on him. Overall seems like a scary heart of the army, particularly in the Berserker Warband. He also could be a central unit in Cult of Blood as well, as he's a monster unit that can't get shot down due to lone operative. Then finally for this tier, and certainly competing for perhaps the single strongest unit in the World Eaters book, weirdly enough we have the furious firepower of the Forge Fiend, perhaps the single biggest winner of Games Workshop's trend in making a whole bunch of World Eaters guns rapid fire, meaning that with the Ballistic Skill 4+, they now are worse at longer range, but a lot more furious at close range. For the Forge Fiend though, it also gets the special rule where it gets to reroll hit rolls against the closest unit within 18 inches, so that means when you give it 3 Ectoplasma Cannons, you get an average of 9 shots at strength 10, AP 3, damage 3, hitting on 4's rerolling. And then with 3 copies of the Blast special rule, so say if you're targeting a 5-man Space Marine squad or something, you average 9 hits at that strength 10, damage 3 profile. With that sheer amount of damage coming out of it, it's going to be great against everything from hordes all the way up to the toughest vehicles around, even if it only really does get good at close range, and seems like most people are including either 2 or 3 of them in a 2,000 point army list to give just a little bit of absolutely furious firepower to support the melee advance. It's also very relevant in the Khorne Demonkin detachment as well, where if you manage to destroy something in the shooting phase, then you could spawn a unit of Bloodletters there with the stratagem, and then have them go on to make a really easy charge deep into enemy lines. For weaknesses, I'd say its defense isn't standout, but is adequate for 150 points. It's not notably terrible, and maybe in theory its main weakness will be being locked up. That -1 to hit is just a little bit painful on the Ectoplasma Cannons, and the blast weapons wouldn't be able to fire into melee with itself. If that happens though, then it probably means you've got enemy units right at the front of the army, and World Eaters are likely to have no shortage of things to countercharge with. Overall though, they're murderously dangerous, and seem to be fairly auto-include for optimised lists right now. I think maybe at least have some argument to be one of the most efficient World Eaters units on paper. Finally, we've got the Demons Units. They're only relevant in the Khorne Demonkin detachment, but at least that is one of the ones that's seeing competitive play. For these ones, rather than going for tiers of power, I feel like it made more sense just to include them in the ones that seem to reliably make the cut and ones that seem not to. Basically, it seems like 4 of the 5 datasheets are strong enough to see regular play there though. The Bloodletters are unusually cheap for the Demonkin at 90 points. They don't get OC2, but they do get that rather godly stratagem where something dies and they can immediately manifest, and it could be due to some shooting from a Forge Fiend, or maybe even Blood Crushers killing something in the charge phase. It is pretty wild to get a whole bunch of Hellblade attacks exactly where you need them. The Fleshhounds are nice, cheap return to reserves units, so pretty excellent for doing secondary objectives. They still have some threats to bully some sort of medium to lighter infantry units too. Scarbrand seems to be the focal centre point of a bunch of lists. Brutal strength 16 damage 6 attacks, or a bunch of strength 8 damage 2 sweeps. His defense seems adequate with 20 wounds and his 4+ invulnerable save, and he's fast enough to make melee with advance and charge. At 305 points it looks like he's cheap enough to make the cut, whereas Angron doesn't seem to be. Then there's the Blood Crushers, the Khornate Cavalry on their brazen steeds. Often they're taken as one big heavier unit led by a Juggernaut Lord for the Blessings of Khorne. I'm not sure it's intended, but I think rules as written at the moment that will confer to them, as it's not a keyword, it's a unit rule. They can hit really hard between all their generalist profiles and their mortal wound impact hits, and could even be a rapid ingress threat if desired. At the moment it just seems that the regular Bloodthirster is the one that seems to see the least interest out of any of these. Scarbrand just being overall more scary here. It seems that Bloodthirsters often tend to get the nod for the more generic Demons ones when they've got some really good enhancements in both Shadow Legion and the Demon Incursion, but it seems that people aren't quite so keen on them with the support that they can get in the Demonkin detachment. In any case, I'll leave that one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts as to the World Eaters down in the comments. Which units would you rate stronger or weaker right now, and why? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. Before I go, I'll just circle back to the video sponsor and Titan's Terrain for those interested, and talk over a few pros, cons and specific offerings for their pop-up cardboard terrain system. For the biggest advantages of this one, as mentioned, I'd say the biggest selling point is that it's really quite easy to store, packing inside these small boxes, so good for transport, or if space is limited, it's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, or at least somewhat comparable to MDF offerings, and it doesn't need any painting or assembly for those who have time pressure, it's ready to go immediately. For the downsides for it, it's a bit less sturdy or hard wearing than plastic or MDF, given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat, so there's obviously trade-offs. It can be hard to put big models in the tops of ruins and things, and the grid layout does mean that there's less flexibility than some terrain sets. You can get some variety from rotation and placement of the exact tiles, though it might not be the worst idea to have just a tiny bit of supplemental terrain to break up some of the firing lanes it can create. In general though, anecdotally I have heard that it can make for a usable casual gaming table. For their specific sets they've got this Forgotten Furnace one with a bunch of chaos glowing runes and foundries, a Shattered Hive one with a slightly more bombed out Imperial City sort of vibe, and then a more verdant ruin set with an overgrown capital with ruins that could apply to the far future or to a fantasy setting. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set as well, pushing two tiles together to make one great big building, either a cathedral or a great big spire thing for the foundry. In any case though, there'll be links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at them, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. In any case, I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts on the World Eaters units down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.